And this is my mum's retirement project, my Stepson said, raising his glass toward me across the table. He punched out at 60, and she's been carrying him ever since. The laughter wasn't enormous. Maybe 6 or 7 people out of the 20 seated around the long table at Domus Cafe in Ottawa's Byward Market. But in a private dining room, 6 people laughing at the same thing feels like a verdict. I didn't respond. I set down my fork, reached for my water glass, and took a slow sip. My wife, Maureen, was sitting 2 seats to my left. She laughed too, briefly, softly, wearing that expression she always put on when she wanted to seem like a good sport. I watched it happen in my peripheral vision and said nothing. My stepson's name is Bryce. He's 33. He works as a senior financial analyst for a consulting firm with offices in Ottawa and Toronto. He has a confident handshake, good teeth, and the particular energy of someone who has recently been promoted and hasn't yet learned how to carry it quietly. His fiancée, Kelsey, sat beside him, smiling at her lap. The dinner had been called to celebrate their engagement. Maureen and I had driven from our house in Manotick that evening. 45 minutes in light traffic, past the airport, down Bank Street. I'd worn a blazer. I'd arrived with a card. I had genuinely meant to enjoy the evening. I hadn't planned on becoming the punchline. The table held a mix of people. Kelsey's parents, a few of Bryce's colleagues, 2 of Maureen's friends, and a man named Miles, who'd been seated at the far end beside one of Kelsey's relatives. Miles was 71. We'd worked together for nearly 2 decades before he retired, back when I was still managing infrastructure contracts for the federal government. We hadn't seen each other in a few years. It was a coincidence he was there at all. He knew Kelsey's father through some mutual association, and Maureen had bumped into him a few months back and passed along the invitation. Miles hadn't laughed at my stepson's comment. I noticed that specifically. Most people had either laughed or nodded politely, the way people do when they don't quite understand a joke, but don't want to seem slow. Miles had done neither. He'd set down his glass very deliberately and looked at me. Not at Bryce, at me. Then he looked back at his plate. That look stayed with me longer than the laughter did. Bryce kept going, the way he does when he thinks something is landing well. He's always had a performer's instinct, the kind that mistakes attention for approval. Seriously, though, he said, still grinning, it's impressive. Early retirement, no mortgage, mom's pension topping up the lifestyle. He swept a hand toward me like a game show host presenting a prize. The man figured out something the rest of us are still working toward. A few more chuckles. Kelsey touched his arm. He didn't read it as a warning. Maureen said something like, "Oh, stop," but softly. The kind of stop that means continue. The conversation moved on. Appetizers arrived. Someone asked about the wedding date. I ate my food and said very little for the rest of the meal. On the drive home, Maureen talked about Kelsey's dress ideas and how lovely the restaurant had been. I answered in single sentences. She didn't ask me what was wrong. Maybe she assumed I was tired. Maybe she knew and preferred not to open the conversation. I pulled into the garage at 9:30. We went our separate ways inside. Her to the living room with a book, me to the kitchen with a cup of decaf I didn't really want. I stood at the counter and looked out at the backyard. The creek that runs along the back edge of our property had a thin crust of ice on it. November in Ontario. 53 minutes later, my phone rang. Miles. I answered immediately. "You still up?" he said, wide awake. A pause. I should have said something tonight. It's fine. It isn't. But that's a longer conversation. Another pause. Can you meet me for breakfast tomorrow? We agreed on Bridgehead on Bank Street. 8 o'clock. I barely slept. The next morning was gray and cold, the kind of Ottawa November that feels like the city reminding you it could be much worse by December. I was there 15 minutes early. Miles arrived exactly at 8, stamped the snow off his boots at the door, and slid into the chair across from me. He ordered his coffee. I already had mine. "How long has he been saying things like that?" he asked. I frowned. Last night wasn't the first time I'd heard something like it, but it was the first time he'd done it in a room full of people. Miles nodded slowly. It's not just last night. I looked at him. What do you mean? He wrapped both hands around his mug. Jim Douglas, remember him? He was at my retirement party, worked in procurement at Public Works. Vaguely. He knows Bryce, runs into him at industry events. He mentioned something to me last spring. Miles paused. I let it go because I figured he'd misunderstood the situation. Then last night I heard it straight from the boy's own mouth. I waited. Your stepson has been telling people that Maureen is the breadwinner, that she carried the household while you coasted, that her pension and savings are essentially what keeps the lights on. Miles met my eyes. He doesn't say it to be cruel. He says it like it's simply a fact. I stared at my coffee cup. How long? I asked. At least 2 years, maybe longer. The first response to something like that isn't anger. It's confusion. You run a mental inventory of every conversation, every family dinner, every offhand comment, and you wonder what you missed. How a story this far from the truth had been traveling through Ottawa social circles without your knowledge. The truth was simple. I had retired at 60. Not because Maureen was supporting me. Because 28 years in federal infrastructure contracting had produced a pension I could actually live on, a paid-off RRSP, and a house I'd bought outright in 2007. 6 years before Maureen and I had ever met. I'd been a project manager. My name had been on 14 major government contracts across Ontario and Quebec, including a bridge rehabilitation in Kingston that came in 4 months ahead of schedule and $600,000 under budget. I wasn't bragging about any of it. I'd simply worked hard, lived carefully, and reached 60 with options. Maureen's pension was her own. What I had was my own. The two things had almost nothing to do with each other. He believes it, I said finally. That's what bothers me. He's not inventing a story. He actually believes it. Miles nodded. That's exactly what troubled me last spring when Jim mentioned it. There's a difference between gossip and conviction. We talked for another hour. By the time I drove home, something had shifted. Not in what I felt, in what I was willing to keep tolerating. I spent that afternoon in my home office, a small room off the back hallway with bookshelves, an old oak desk, and a filing cabinet I'd brought from my previous condo. I opened it and started pulling folders. I'd been organized my whole career. Project managers have to be. The wedding deposit. Chateau Montebello, 3 hours from Ottawa, a beautiful spot and an expensive one. I'd paid the deposit, $35,000. I found the wire transfer confirmation and entered it into a spreadsheet. Then, I kept going. My stepson's first car, when he was 22 and couldn't qualify for financing. $12,000, framed as a loan, never repaid. A credit line consolidation when he was 27, and the interest was eating him alive. $19,400. Down payment assistance when he and Kelsey bought their first place, a condo in Centertown. They'd been 2 years short of what the bank required. I'd contributed $60,000, no paperwork, just a bank transfer because it was family. Graduate school application fees, a move from Halifax back to Ottawa. An emergency when his car was written off on the 417, and he needed a rent for 3 months while the insurance dispute dragged on. I kept entering numbers. The afternoon got darker. The backyard creek disappeared into shadow. By 4 o'clock, the total on my screen read $247,600. I sat back in my chair and looked at it. It wasn't the number itself that was stunning. Over 28 years in contracting, I'd managed budgets that dwarfed this. What was stunning was the realization attached to the number. That I had spent $247,000, step by step, moment by moment, because I'd wanted to be useful. Because I'd wanted him to have a smoother start than I'd had. Because I believed, quietly and without demanding anything in return, that family was worth the investment. And the story being told about me, the story traveling through Ottawa dinner parties and office conversations I hadn't been part of, was that I was the one being carried. I closed the spreadsheet and sat there for a long time. 2 days later, my neighbor Joan called. We chatted about the cold snap, about the creek frozen solid behind my property, about a new place that had opened near the Manotick village. Then, without quite meaning to, she said something that changed the shape of everything. "I always thought it was lovely, actually," Joan said. "Maureen taking care of everything while you had your retirement. It's not so common these days." I went very still. "What do you mean?" I asked. Joan sounded immediately careful, the way people do when they realize they put their foot through ice. "Oh, I just meant, that she mentioned. I might be misremembering." "What did she mention, Joan?" A pause that lasted just long enough. "She jokes about it sometimes, just lightly, about being the one keeping things afloat." I thanked her. I kept my voice even. We said goodbye. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after I hung up. A crow landed on the back fence, looked around, and flew off. It wasn't that Maureen had invented the story. She isn't that kind of person. But she had let it exist. She had made the easy joke, the one that cast her as the capable woman carrying her retired husband. And she had made it enough times that Joan had absorbed it as fact. And if Joan had absorbed it, others had too. And if Bryce had heard a version of it from his mother, even once, the rest had been easy arithmetic. People don't need a full story. They just need one piece in the wrong place, and they build the rest themselves. That evening, when Maureen came home from her book club, I was waiting at the kitchen table. "I spoke with Joan today," I said. Maureen set her bag on the counter. "Oh?" She said something interesting about you carrying the household while I enjoy my retirement. A pause. A small, almost imperceptible shift in her expression. Not guilt exactly. More like recognition. The face of someone who knows the moment has finally arrived. "It was just a joke," she said. Joan didn't think it was a joke. Maureen rubbed her forehead. "It's not like that." "Then, what is it like?" She sat down. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then she said, "It's easier. When Bryce says things, it's just easier not to." She stopped. "Not correct him." She didn't answer, which was its own answer. I told her about the spreadsheet. Not dramatically, calmly, methodically. The wedding deposit, the car, the condo down payment, the consolidation loan. The years of small emergencies I'd covered without being asked and without expecting anything in return. $247,000. The color left her face slowly, like water going out of a basin. "I didn't know the total," she said quietly. Neither did I, until I sat down and looked. We talked for a long time that evening. Not a fight. Something harder than a fight. An honest conversation between two people who had let things slide too long. By the time it was over, I felt wrung out, but clearer than I'd been in years. I called my lawyer the next morning. He'd been my lawyer for 19 years. He didn't waste words. Then I wrote a letter. 1 page. I left it on the kitchen island 3 days later, before Bryce and Kelsey were due to come for dinner. Then I drove across the river to Gatineau and sat in a parking lot near the Maison du Citoyen for an hour, watching people go by, drinking bad vending machine coffee. When I got home, Maureen was on the phone with Bryce. I could hear her tone from the hallway, tight, controlled, trying to manage something that had already gone sideways. The letter said what needed to be said. Effective immediately, I would not be covering the Chateau Montebello deposit. I would not be providing further financial assistance without a specific, documented conversation. I listed, briefly, what I had contributed over 4 years, and I explained, simply, without accusations, that I was not withdrawing out of anger. I was withdrawing because generosity without acknowledgement eventually becomes expectation, and I had noticed, without bitterness, that expectation had arrived. My stepson called me 16 times that day. I counted. He texted 14 more times. The following evening, Kelsey called. Her voice was quiet and genuinely apologetic in a way Bryce's wouldn't have been. She said she thought I deserved to know something. That Bryce had been assuming, not hoping, assuming that I would cover any overage on the wedding budget. That he had told her, more than once, that the house in Manotick would eventually come to them. because it had been part of Maureen's world since before Kelsey had known either of them. I let that sit for a moment. Kelsey, I said, that house has been mine since 2007. I bought it free and clear, 6 years before I ever met your mother-in-law. A long silence on the line. He doesn't know that, she said softly. No, he doesn't. I thanked her for calling. I meant it. The event was my stepson's idea. He called it a family dinner, his words, and booked a private room at the Mill Street Brew pub in the Glebe. He sent the invitation as a text with a date and a time. No explanation, no context. I went, partly because I wanted to see what he was actually planning. Partly because at 63, I've learned that a conversation doesn't make it go away. It just makes it find you somewhere worse. The room had maybe 30 people in it. Kelsey's parents, friends of theirs, colleagues of Bryce's from his firm, a few of Maureen's friends, and Miles, who told me later he'd received an invitation because Bryce had wanted a full family presence. My stepson gave a speech. He always gives speeches. He's technically good at them. Clear voice, good posture, the right pauses in the right places. About 20 minutes in, he shifted his tone. He talked about family, about the people who show up for you, about commitments that matter. He made eye contact with me twice during that stretch, pointedly enough that a few people nearby glanced my way to see how I was reacting. Sometimes, he said, when someone says they'll be there for you, and then they're suddenly not, you have to ask yourself what that commitment was ever really worth. The room went quiet, not the comfortable kind. I sat with my hands folded on the table and said nothing. I had made a decision, weeks earlier, that I would not be the one to lose my composure first. Miles, however, stood up. He stood the way he'd always moved through a room when something important needed to be addressed. Without theatrics, but with the settled authority of a man who had made large decisions his whole working life and had very little left to prove. Bryce, he said. The room shifted. My stepson looked at him, surprised. Before you continue, there are a few things this room should probably know. Miles looked around the table once. I've known your stepfather for 27 years. We worked together on federal infrastructure projects, from Winnipeg to Quebec City. There were years when his signature was on more government contracts than most senior partners at any firm in this city. My stepson's expression changed, not dramatically, but in the way that happens when a room stops moving in the direction you planned. Miles continued. He didn't retire at 60 because anyone was carrying him. He retired because he'd earned it, because he'd spent 3 decades doing work that you can drive across and stand on and trust with your life. He paused. And because the house in Manotick that you're currently assuming will come to you was purchased, free and clear, 6 years before he ever met your mother. The room went very still. Someone near the back set down a glass too loudly. Bryce started to say something. Miles held up one hand, not rudely, just firmly. The gesture of a man who has run enough meetings to know when someone needs to stop. I should have said this weeks ago, Miles said. I didn't. That's on me, but I'm saying it now. He sat down. The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't rush to fill itself. My stepson stood at the front of the room with his notes in his hand and nothing useful left in them. And then the venue manager appeared at the door. A young woman, professional, clearly embarrassed to be interrupting. She leaned toward Bryce and said something low. I could read the shape of the conversation from 20 feet away. The deposit, the contract, the outstanding balance. He had booked this room on the same assumption that had run through everything, that someone else would quietly make it work. The color left his face in stages. Kelsey drove him home early that night. Maureen and I left separately and drove back to Manotick, mostly in silence. There was nothing to rush. The following weeks weren't dramatic. No shouting, no ultimatums. Just the long, honest work of 2 people in their late 50s and early 60s realizing that peace built on silence isn't actually peace. It's just postponement with better table manners. Maureen told me, eventually, why she'd let my stepson's version of things go uncorrected for so long. She'd told herself it was harmless, That Bryce needed to feel good about his place in the world. That correcting him would only start a fight she didn't have the energy to finish. Small choices made quietly, over time. Until they became a story. Until the story became something other people had absorbed as fact. I should have told him the truth years ago, she said, one evening. We were sitting on the back porch with blankets and hot tea despite the cold, watching the frozen creek catch the last of the afternoon light. Yes, I said, you should have. I'm sorry. I had waited a long time to hear those words. Not because I'd needed the apology to feel vindicated. Because without it, we couldn't actually move forward. I know, I said. Bryce and I didn't speak for nearly 5 months. The wedding was postponed. Kelsey told Maureen it was due to venue complications. Nobody believed it, but nobody argued either. When my stepson finally called, it was on a Sunday morning in late spring. The ice had long since gone from the creek. There were sparrows in the birch tree at the back of the yard. He sounded different. Not softer exactly, but less certain than usual, in the way that happens to people when life has quietly billed them for something they thought was free. We talked for a long time. Not about money, about assumptions, about the gap between what you think is happening inside a family and what's actually happening. About the strange logic of growing up and deciding, without ever examining the decision, that someone else's patience is bottomless. He apologized. It wasn't a perfect apology. It was honest enough to be a beginning. I didn't know, he said, somewhere in the middle of it. I know you didn't. I should have asked. Yes. We stayed on the phone for another 20 minutes after that, awkward in places, but real. The kind of conversation you can't skip and still call a relationship. Things didn't change overnight. Nothing real does. But they changed, slowly, carefully, with boundaries that hadn't existed before, and probably should have been there from the start. Looking back, I don't regret the money. Not a single dollar of it. Every dollar represented a moment when I chose to show up for someone who needed it. What I regret is the lesson I accidentally taught along the way. That my willingness had no edge, that my generosity had no floor, that kindness offered without expectation is the same as kindness that's owed. It isn't. I learned that late, but I learned it. At 63, standing in my own backyard, on a piece of land I paid for myself, watching the creek finally thaw in the April light. I can tell you, without any performance, that the most useful thing I ever built wasn't a government contract or a signed check or a bridge that came in under budget. It was finally learning when to say, this is who I am. This is what I built, and it was never yours to assume. If you've spent years trying to prove your worth to people who've already written their own version of your story, I hope you find your way to that same quiet certainty. Protect what you've earned. And keep your kindness. Just stop letting it be mistaken for weakness.